Social Studies World History 7. Analyze European medieval society with regard to culture, politics, society, and economics. Describe how increasing trade led to the growth of towns and cities. Include the impact of the bubonic plague. Throughout history, the bubonic plague has gone by many names. Sometimes it is referred to as the Black Death, or the Great Plague, or the Black Plague, or simply the plague. By whatever name it is called, the disease and the accompanying waves of additional outbreaks that have recurred over time have killed millions of people, making it the most devastating pandemic in human history. As the waves of plague swept repeatedly throughout world population centers in both hemispheres over the course of several hundred years, it created a series of social, economic, and religious upheavals. The plague has unknown origins, but the earliest historical accounts of the disease indicate that it began in Central Asia in 1338 or 39 and reached China and India by 1346. By 1347, the disease had reached the port of Kaffa on the Black Sea, where legend has it, the Mongols infected the city by propelling dead plague victims over the walls in an early form of biological warfare, in an attempt to bring down the fortified city. The bacterium Yersinia pestis is believed to have been the cause of the disease, and humans contract the disease by being bitten by a flea that is a carrier of the bacterium or by coming into contact with a mammal that is infected with plague. Due to climate change, the dry grasslands of Western Asia became even more arid during the 14th century, which caused a displacement of the rodents that were native to that region. The increase of trade interactions along the Silk routes of Asia, which connected the East with the population centers of Europe, enabled the plague to travel with swift and deadly ease. It has been proposed that, in addition to being spread through land routes, that the disease was also carried by oriental rat fleas, living on the black rats that were regular passengers on merchant ships. This spread the infection throughout the trade centers of the Indian Ocean, Mediterranean, and Europe. Regardless of its mode of entry, the Black Death is estimated to have killed somewhere between 30 to 60% of Europe's total population, and may have reduced the world population from about 450 million to around 350 million during the 14th century alone. It would take 200 years for the world population to recover to its previous levels, and the plague continued to recur with additional outbreaks in Europe until the 19th century. First-hand accounts provide valuable glimpses into what life was like during outbreaks of the plague and are available from a variety of sources. The Byzantine historian Procopius reported that when plague struck Constantinople in 1347, as many as 10,000 people a day perished. However, that figure has not been verified. He stated that without adequate space in which to bury so many dead, the bodies were simply left stacked in the open. Funerals and last rites were often left unattended to, and the entire city smelled like decaying corpses. In his book, Secret History, he records that the countryside was also devastated and recounts the response of the Emperor Justinian in dealing with the issue. When pestilence swept through the whole known world, and notably the Roman Empire, wiping out most of the farming community, and of necessity leaving a trail of desolation in its wake, Justinian showed no mercy toward the ruined freeholders. Even then, he did not refrain from demanding the annual tax, not only the amount at which he assessed each individual, but also the amount for which his deceased neighbors were liable. Justinian's mode of continuing the economic stability of the Byzantine Empire was described as excessively harsh and reveals Procopius's poor opinion of the imperial government's ability to address the threat. Plague reached the trade center of Florence, Italy via Venice in March of 1348, and this event is very well documented. In his book Decameron, Giovanni Boccaccio states, "Such fear and fanciful notions took possession of the living that almost all of them adopted the same cruel policy, which was entirely to avoid the sick and everything belonging to them. By so doing, each one thought he would secure his own safety." The severity of the plague also strained the resources and rituals of the Church. Such was the multitude of corpses brought to the churches every day, and almost every hour, that there was not enough consecrated ground to give them burial, especially since they wanted to bury each person in the family grave according to the old custom. Although the cemeteries were full, they were forced to dig huge trenches where they buried the bodies by hundreds. Here they stowed them away like bales in the hold of a ship and covered them with a little earth until the whole trench was full. The disease affected the social structures of Italian society. One citizen avoided another. Hardly any neighbor troubled about others. Relatives never or hardly ever visited each other. Moreover, such terror was struck into the hearts of men and women by this calamity, that brother abandoned brother, and the uncle his nephew, and the sister her brother, and very often the wife her husband. What is even worse and nearly incredible is that fathers and mothers refused to see and tend their children, as if they had not been theirs. The disease killed rapidly. How many valiant men, how many fair ladies, breakfast with their kinfolk and the same night supped with their ancestors in the next world. The condition of the people was pitiable to behold. They sickened by the thousands daily, and died unattended and without help. The reactions of the healthy varied. Some thought that moderate living would preserve them from the epidemic. They formed small communities, living entirely separate from everybody else. They shut themselves up in houses where there were no sick, eating the finest food and drinking the best wine very temperately, avoiding all excess, allowing no news or discussion of death and sickness, and passing the time in music and such like pleasures. Others thought just the opposite. They thought the sure cure for the plague was to drink and be merry, to go about singing and amusing themselves, satisfying every appetite they could, laughing and jesting at what happened. They put their words into practice, spent day and night going from tavern to tavern, drinking immoderately, or went into other people's houses, doing only those things which pleased them. This they could easily do because everyone felt doomed and had abandoned his property, so that most houses became common property, and any stranger who went in made use of them as if he had owned them, and with all this bestial behavior, they avoided the sick as much as possible. With so much social upheaval, the structures of government began to break down. In this suffering and the misery of our city, the authority of human and divine laws almost disappeared, for, like other men, the ministers and the executors of the laws were all dead or sick or shut up with their families, so that no duties were carried out. Every man was therefore able to do as he pleased. The Marchione di Coppa Stefani, a citizen of Florence, writing of events around 1380, stated, "Neither physicians nor medicines were effective, whether because these illnesses were previously unknown or because physicians had not previously studied them. There seemed to be no cure. There was such a fear that no one seemed to know what to do. When it took hold in a house, it often happened that no one remained who had not died. And it was not just that men and women died, but even sentient animals died. Dogs, cats, chickens, oxen, donkeys, and sheep showed the same symptoms and died of the same disease, and almost none, or very few, who showed these symptoms were cured. The symptoms were the following: a bubo in the groin, where the thigh meets the trunk, or a small swelling under the armpit, sudden fever, spitting blood and saliva, and no one who spat blood survived it. It was such a frightful thing that when it got into a house, as was said, no one remained. Frightened people abandoned the house and fled to another." Prior to the plague, Florence was a bustling city of around 120,000. But by 1351, the population of Florence had been reduced to approximately 50,000. From Italy, the plague spread throughout Europe. It headed west to Spain and north to France. The plague advanced as people moved from town to town, and soon reached England, which lost approximately 50% of the population of her major port cities in about 18 months. In 1348, Pierre Lunel de Montaigne described the height of the outbreak in Toulouse, France, by quoting a citizen, saying, "They died by the hundreds, both day and night, and all were thrown in ditches and covered with earth, and as soon as those ditches were filled, more were dug, and I, Agnolo di Tura, buried my 5 children with my own hands." and so many died that all believed it was the end of the world. By 1349, the Black Death had entered Central Europe, Scandinavia, and Greenland. Interestingly, Yersinia pestis may have weakened, or either populations developed a stronger resistance to the virulent strain, since the mortality rate decreased as the plague spread into Eastern Europe and Russia. In 1352, the plague reached Moscow, which is only a few hundred miles from Kaffa, the first city impacted by the epidemic. The plague had completed a large circle, wiping out from 1/3 to 1/2 of Europe's total population in roughly 5 years. At the end of this first wave of plague, the social structures of medieval Europe were altered as the disease affected and reduced the populations of all classes, but most notably the serfs. This reduction in population impacted economic systems, as the decrease in labor led to food shortages. Additionally, the previously authoritative Roman Catholic Church lost stature, as people looked to the Church to provide both spiritual support and divine solutions. The priests who called on the sick to hear final confessions and to administer last rites were also impacted by the disease, and the number of healthy priests rapidly decreased in number, and one estimate states that the mortality rate for priests during the first wave of plague may have been as high as 42 to 45%. Pope Clement VI felt the pressure of a Europe without an adequate number of priests. He declared that the dying could make their confession to anyone present, even to women, and that it would still lead to salvation. This was a large step for the Church and reversed the policy that only ordained priests could hear confession and administer rites. The empowerment of the individual to act as priest on such a wide scale is considered to be one of the contributing factors of the Protestant Reformation, which began in 1517. Plague has revisited Europe and other world regions several times since the 14th century, but successive waves were never as aggressive as the original. According to the World Health Organization, from 2010 to 2015, there were 3,248 cases reported worldwide, including 584 deaths. In modern times, plague is most common in rural areas of Central Africa, the Andean region of South America, Central Asia, and the western United States Rocky Mountain region, and is easily treated with early diagnosis and antibiotics.